All right, we're going to go ahead and start in a couple of minutes. We have a few people still coming in, so um, we'll get started in just a few minutes. Thank you for being with us, everyone.
Okay, I've got 11:02. Kristen, I think we can probably get started. We've got a bunch of attendees. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Yeah, well, hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Salinas, and I am the marketing manager for our business analytics discipline. I'm joined by Eric Weber. He is our portfolio manager, and Leslie Hendricks, and she is one of our authors from Modern Business Analytics. She's going to be taking the reins today and leading you through our webinar presentation about utilizing R in your courses. So do you have another slide, Eric?
Yeah, just a reminder about today's session. This is a Zoom webinar, which is slightly different than the Zoom meetings that many of us are used to from other events. Just a reminder then that you can raise your hand, you can input in the chat and in the Q&A. And so we invite you to participate that way. All of you are unable to share your videos and microphones, so this would be the best way for you to interact is on chat. So feel free to launch or put anything you have for us in chat and Q&A. I also see a lot of friendly I shouldn't say faces because I can't see your faces. A lot of friendly names. So many of you are returning from other events and you've been involved in a lot of things. So I just want to welcome you. And if you're first time with us, thank you for joining us. You're in for a treat hearing from Leslie with R. So that is where we are at. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to you, Leslie. And while we do that, we're going to try to launch. We had a couple polls prepared here. So I'm going to launch one polling question for the group. If you wouldn't mind participating, that's another fun way for us to hear from you. So as you can see in chat or on the poll there, it's the question of when do your students take their first business analytics course? So we're getting responses there, which is great. I'll end the poll in a moment and share the results as Leslie's pulling up. Are you able to share your screen with us, Leslie?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to. So can you see that?
Yeah, it's coming up. I'm going to end the poll. We haven't quite had 100% participation. We'll give you one more minute or not a whole minute, a few more seconds. Okay, let me end the poll here. I'll share the results and I'll bring that down in just a moment. So I'll kick it to you, Leslie. Go ahead.
Okay, so interesting poll results. My students take their second statistics course, which is basically business analytics, in their sophomore year. So it looks like I'm joined by many who have that same scenario. So anyway, I'm Leslie Hendricks. I am a clinical associate professor at the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. And today I'm going to talk, let me get this poll out of the way. There we go. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we implemented R and why we did so at the business school at the University of South Carolina. All right, so business students at the Darla Moore School of Business take 2 statistics courses. And the first course is a basic introduction to business statistics. They'll learn a t-test and, descriptive statistics, confidence intervals, and that sort of thing. And they use Excel. And the second course covers more advanced topics. We cover logistic regression, multiple regression, log models, elasticities, time series, a little bit of regularization. So we get into some more advanced topics. So obviously I wanted to switch from Excel to R. So the first time I taught it, I used Excel for both courses and just showed output from those advanced methodologies and asked them questions about it. But I desperately wanted my students to be able to not have to get mired down in the details of workarounds and not actually being able to do their own analyses. So I piloted R in my 2 sections of the course in spring of 2018. So we have about 9 or 10 sections every semester with about 100 students per section. So once my students got over the hurdle of learning basic coding, they had a much more solid grasp of the statistical concepts that were taught. And in the student evaluations, they liked learning R versus disliked it 5-1. So we thought that was pretty great. So my department chair was excited, and he talked to the dean, and then it became mandatory across all sections of our course in the fall of 2018. And so student perception, these are just some unsolicited feedback that I got in student evaluations about R at the end of the semester. So I wish I could have learned more about R. When I took this class, I was one of the lucky students to learn how to code in R. I feel that we didn't have much time to develop this amazing skill in class. Another student, it helped at the career fair to differentiate me from other people. Also, I would love to take more data science courses, and I hope they're offered. And lastly, even though sometimes I'm not using R directly, the coding language was a good way for me to understand other coding like SQL, for example. So now why R or Python and not some off-the-shelf statistics software like Minitab or SAS or SPSS? So if you do a quick search in Indeed, this was done recently, maybe last month, if you look for R or Python, I came up with 26,061 job openings currently. And then I filtered it down. I was curious about salaries. I filtered it down to $70,000 plus for the salary, and it still had 19,317 jobs. And then I made the experience level entry level, and it still came up with entry level jobs with R or Python starting at $70,000 or more. There are over 2,000 jobs available. So obviously, learning how to code in these open source, free, flexible scripting languages is in high demand. So Matt Taddy, he's actually the main author on the book that we just published. He's the first author. He's a VP for Amazon Private Brands. I asked him to give me some, insight that I could share with my students. So he said, business analysts at all levels at Amazon will be much more insightful and productive if they learn how to pull, manipulate, and analyze data using scripting languages. And anyone working with data will need to continue learning and updating their computational and methodological skills. So this is kind of how I help convince them in that first class that learning this skill is actually worth the time and the investment. All right, so how do we do it at the Darla Moore School of Business? Well, I teach R in the very first lecture, even if I can just get through the syllabus and have them download and install R and get that cursor. That's good enough for me for that first lecture, but we hit the ground running with it and just get our feet wet right away with it. Now you'll notice that I'm here teaching at the podium one day, and you'll notice that I have a Windows machine and I also have a Mac. So I learned that if I'm presenting on Windows all the time, the Mac users felt like they were having a completely different experience. So I was lucky enough to be able to have both computers with me. But if you don't have a Mac or you don't have a Windows, I find before I had one, I found that I could use the students to help each other when they felt like something looked a lot different. It really is basically the same. There are a couple little differences. For example, when you open a script file on a Windows machine, it's called a script file and it's called a document on a Mac. But it's nice if you can kind of help both of them feel comfortable with it, because I find that when they download R, and this is the console that you're looking at right here, the left picture is the console on my Windows computer and the right picture is the console on my Mac. And just having that cursor as the only thing that they can do to interact with R, it strikes fear in my students. And so I find that my main goal for the semester is getting them to not be afraid of only having a cursor, not being afraid to read a help file and try to, figure out the code to accomplish something. All right, so I incorporate R into lecture slides and videos. I demonstrate it in almost every class. We always include R code in the slides and notes. I also include a script file with all of the examples code in there. And students are strongly encouraged to work through the examples with me. Even in my online class, I talk to them about switching back and forth and running the code that I'm running, because it's kind of like coding is like learning another language. You have to practice it, or learning to swim. Like you can't watch me swim and learn how to swim. So I always encourage them to actually do it themselves. So we
Leslie,
have four.
a question from the audience here.
Mhm.
Kevin asked if you used RStudio.
I'm getting there.
While you're answering that, I'm going to launch the poll to see who else is using R to some form or fashion in their class. So
Okay.
that. Go ahead, answer that question if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm using base R, and I'm going to actually talk about that in about 2 seconds.
Oh,
So,
perfect.
yeah, I have some slides directly addressing that. It's obviously a big decision what you're going to use if you're deciding to use R. So I use base R. We have 4 case studies and 3 projects that we use, that the students get to use R. I find that students need a lot of support outside of class if you're teaching any kind of coding language. 99.9% of our students at the Darla Moore School of Business don't have any coding experience. They're actually not really comfortable even writing a function, I find, in Excel. They find it kind of intimidating. So they need a lot of support outside of class, and the proper level and amount of support yields a much better student experience. So for us, we have gone to larger lectures, and so I needed more support other than 3 instructors across 850 students or so. And so we started what we call the data lab at the Darla Moore School of Business, and we staff it with MBA students and some undergraduate students. So in the fall of 2018, we had MBA students. They're trained to mentor our students with R and course topics. We didn't have a dedicated space, and I show this picture because I think it's hilarious. Not really hilarious, but it's a memory. It's a fun memory. When we were homeless, we got kicked out of our room that we reserved one day, and so our GAs were helping the students in the hall on the bench. So anyway, by the fall of 2019, we got some space. We actually commandeered a lobby, like an open area in our building, and you can see the tape was still on the glass walls when I took this picture. And so we now have a dedicated space for the data lab for our students to come get help. That's just the way we worked it out at the Darla Moore School of Business. But I can also help my students on my own. I'm going to have some tips for you for how you can help them. So this is the conference room across the hall where our students can work on assignments and projects together and come back across the hall where the staff is to ask questions when they get stuck. And that's just some smiling faces of our data lab staff. I always figured some smiling faces are always good to see. So I love working with our MBAs in there. All right, now to answer your question. So I recommend that you make a very deliberate choice between R and RStudio. So just decide on one and then go with that one. And especially if you have multiple sections of a course that other colleagues are teaching, I strongly recommend that you all use the same thing. You don't want one student thinking they're having a better experience in the other section because they're using RStudio or using the base R or whatever. So we definitely all use the same thing. It's difficult to update your screenshots and examples if you switch hastily later. So again, just make sure that you do a lot of research. Now, how did I decide to use base R? Well, if a student can code in R, they can always translate that to RStudio, but not vice versa, specifically like calling in a file. If they can use the menu-driven options in RStudio, they might be a little stuck when they first go to base R. RStudio is not guaranteed to be free forever. It looks like it might always have a base version that's free, but I was hesitant to switch at first when they came out. And I want my students to understand how to call in a file and to know what a path is on their computer. I find that my students really don't know what a path is, especially the Mac users, because they have such great search functionality in the Macs to find their documents. And one thing that you should note is if you use actual big data and you're using some very computationally intensive scripts, that I find on my Windows machine, RStudio crashes, and I have a pretty good computer with a lot of compute power on it. It doesn't do that on my Mac, but it does do it on my Windows. So it's just something to keep in mind. Maybe run all of your code that you want to teach before you decide on one versus the other. Now, this is what RStudio interface looks like. So it's got 4 quadrants and it's got little scroll bars for the different quadrants. And so you can resize the quadrants, but they're always on your screen. So you'll see the top left is a script editor. The bottom left is the console where you execute code. The bottom right is a graphics. It shows the graphics, and the top right is like got some other tabs. You can see the history and the environment and the objects that you have in your workspace. This is base R, and I can move these windows around anywhere I want instead of being limited to having all 4 of those on my screen at once. I can put some kind of on top of the other, move them around. I can resize them. I still have my slider bars. And you can see here that that left screen, the console, I can resize it to whatever size I want. So for me, I was used to coding in base R, and I like having the freedom to move my windows all over the place and some other things about it. So I just kind of stayed with it, especially because some of the scripts I was running were crashing on RStudio. So that's where I am right now. I might be convinced to go to RStudio another day, but that's just where I am at the current moment with R versus RStudio. So some specific tips from me: use a text that has examples in R. Don't use one that has your examples in some other language or Excel or something like that. You want to have a full immersive experience with R. And you're using R, so teach cool things. You can teach logistic regression, out of sample performance, regularization, classification. These things can be run lots of times with a single line of code or just a couple lines of code, and they can dial up powerful results within a few seconds. So I'm currently teaching out of Modern Business Analytics. So the author team is Matt Taddy, that I already talked about from Amazon, myself, and Matt Harding at UC Irvine. And it goes over all kinds of cool methods. It's actually a book about how to do data science approach to business analytics. I'm using it in a pure, statistics course, covering the first 3 chapters: regression, uncertainty quantification, and regularization. I teach a little bit about classification. We've got causal inference with experiments and with controls, trees and forests, factor models like principal components and partial least squares, text as data, which is becoming huge, maybe looking at sentiment analysis from some tweets, and an intro to deep learning. And then there's an appendix that's basically a full chapter in how to code in R. And so I assign this first to my students, and then we go into the actual statistical methods. Another tip from me: for topics that you can't get to in your actual lecture, but you want to show them, assign them in a project or a case. So I only cover the appendix to learn R and the first 3 chapters. So I want to show them other cool things, right? So for their project, their first project, I actually give them code for how to map Uber data using longitude and latitude. And then they have to create a subset and make the legend match with the plotting symbols and put a title on their graphic, and then kind of defend their subset. I use Canvas, so this is just my rubric on the right for how I grade that project, but students really like it because they create something actually cool and tangible as they're working through their code. Confusion matrix for classification. When I teach logistic regression, it's not in the classification chapter, and so I like to mention that to them. So in a recent case, I taught them about the confusion matrix and calculating misclassification rates. And then I talk about a decision rule, give them a little code to get started. And using credit decision data, they actually calculate some of these, positive predictive values and the sensitivity or recall and the specificity. The third tip from me: when students ask for help via email on R code, like if they're not coming into your office hours, have them copy and paste the line of code with the error into your message. Do not allow screenshots. You'll be digging through endless lines of codes and errors, and then you have to type it in yourself, and you probably won't catch their error because you're going to type it in the way it should be. So I highly recommend you to have them copy and paste their code into the email, and then you can copy and paste it in your R console and help diagnose their errors. That helps me be very efficient with my large number of students. Give lots of practice for learning R. Assign low stakes assignments that completely prepare your students for later higher stakes assignments. For example, in my first homework where they actually have to code R, they just have to do some basic calculations like calculating the average of, this was points, it was a wine data set for the Merlot variety for the Sonoma region. So just getting them, learning how to do the basics in R. And then I have them click a button to say that they certify that they used R to obtain all the answers. So that way When we get to the case study, where they have to do some of those same calculations, I disincentivize academic dishonesty. They've already had practice. They've already had a chance to learn and to do it with very low stakes. I provide a starter script for these assignments that gives maybe the code to call in the data and some other things to kind of get them over the hump to get started on the assignment. And then I require the students to provide the code they use to complete the assignment. If you don't do this, they may, if they can complete it, get the answers another way, they might be tempted to do that. So for my case, in this particular case, they were asked to make a prediction from a regression model and then compute a confidence interval for that prediction. And so the starter code that I gave them looks like this on the left of the screen. And in this particular one, I gave them the code to read in the data as long as it's in their working directory, and to change the date variable to a date variable type, and do some other manipulation, give them the code for the plots that I want them to look at and comment on. So I make sure they're looking at the right thing. It's up to you what level of support you want to give them with a starter script, but I found that this is very helpful. And then on the right of the screen is actually the bottom of the starter script file. I make them format their code that they're going to copy and paste to me this way. So all of their answers go in between the hashtag Q1, hashtag Q2 lines. And that way we tell them that we have to be able to copy and paste that, and it should run flawlessly in our console so that me and my graders can grade it without having to reformat their code, make sure that their code actually runs and it actually does provide the answers. And then I just make a last essay question in my Canvas quiz for the case, and this is where they copy and paste their code. It's actually a really good learning experience because I can see how different students approach the problems differently, and we can correct them when, for things like maybe don't put the quotes around a number when you're subsetting on being equal to a number in a column, because that can cause problems later down the road. We can give them tips and advice this way. All right, and tip 6, don't assign coding on a timed assessment like an exam. It's just, I could go on and on about how much of a disaster that can end up being. I actually give multiple choice exams in my class. I don't want them to have to code, under a time constraint, because some of them will become very flustered and very, very frustrated. And if they just had 10 more minutes, they could have finished, but now they can't. So I give multiple choice exams. They're expected to be able to read output and be able to interpret it. For example, here's a recent exam, and I just give I get my working directory, I set my working directory to something different, I call in a data set, and then we look at the output of the structure function, and I can ask them questions like, which folder did this R session look for the Seattle crime data to pull in? So they just need to be able to read that path. We spend a lot of time teaching them that, so they should be able to do that. And basic questions like how many columns are in the data set, how many different beats are included in this data set, and a little bit about how the code works. Like if I ran Seattle $force equals Y, what's that going to give? And then if I do the sum around that, what's that going to give? So you can ask some pretty decent questions in a multiple choice exam when you're teaching them R. All right, and so those are my tips. I wanted to know, I hope that you learned something here that's helpful, and I'd love to answer some questions if you have any.
Yeah, Leslie, it looks like we actually have a question in the chat. Why couldn't you use RM and RMD file and create the HTML file, which will show the R codes and the output instead of asking them to submit codes separately?
Oh, okay. You mean on a test? So, or on the case studies, I bet you they're talking about. Yes, I could totally do that. But for us, since we're using base R, formatting your markdown document is a little bit different than an RMD file. And so we don't teach that currently in my class. And so this is just what we're using right now with the script file. But that's a great way. If you structure your class that way, that would work very, very well too.
It looks like that was applying to both tests and homework.
Yeah, I got it after I thought about it for a second. But yeah, that's a great way. This is just the approach that we're using right now. And honestly, this is one of the reasons that I consider using RStudio, because creating a markdown document is pretty simple using RStudio, and students do like that.
And I don't think you saw in the chat, but we took a little quick poll in the chat, and it looks like RStudio is the favorite. So
Okay. Yeah, I can't see that. So
looks
yeah,
like
we
have
might
some
switch one
polling results.
day.
Sorry, go ahead.
We might switch one day. It's always a good discussion when I tell people we use base R.
Great. And it
But
looks like we do have some polling results on the screen.
Oh,
They were on the
I
screen
just pulled them
for
down.
everyone to see kind of where everyone
There we go.
landed and where they currently use R in their analytics courses. So thank you so much for your feedback. It looks like we do have another question. What is the technical background for your students? I like your book, but I think it's too technical, math heavy for my students.
My students are not very technical at all. So they're required to take a business statistic or in a business calculus course, but they don't even have that. They don't have to take it before they take my course. So we expect no calculus from them. And most of them are terrified of R. So I find that, if you can just demonstrate it and have them, repeat the process and just explain the code, they're having a good time with the book in my class. I think if they didn't have support and they were reading it just by themselves without having me, I assign them to read the text in Connect before class and with using the Smart Book, and they answer some questions about it. And then any questions that they have, it seems like they're getting answered in class. I just took another recent poll for my class since this is new and we're just using this book for the second time. And over half the class is finding the readings to be very helpful for them. They read it in the text and then they hear me explain it in lecture. And I'm not getting students who are saying they said they were terrified when they first started the course, because I also asked them how they felt at the beginning and how they feel now. And like 85% said they felt very good or good in the class right now. So they're having a good time with it.
Leslie, I wanted to just jump in there and share. Right, you've been teaching R for several semesters, and a lot of the book resources you've been using for a while. It's just your second semester with the textbook because it just published out there. So some of the things, right? Leslie's had a lot of, not a lot, but she's had a few semesters under your belt, right? And you've really tweaked some things, and that's why this webinar has been really popular for other instructors that are really just kind of getting the game going with this. And you talked about the resources you provide students, which now you're kind of migrating to what you've been doing over the past and migrating that into Connect. As you answer the next question in chat, I'm also going to launch a poll, and we're almost right at time. I think we can hang out for a few more minutes for Q&A, but I think that's the end of the actual presentation. But the question Simon asked you, and again, I'm launching the poll. Love to hear instructors what you need. Simon asked if the questions that you showed in the presentation are from the textbook, or if those are things that you've kind of come up yourself.
Some of those are in the textbook, and some of them are going to be in the textbook.
There we go. I love it.
Yeah. So
yeah, we definitely have some plans for a second edition and some things. So we'll see a little bit of teaser there, Simon and others.
But if anybody wants to reach out, I'd be happy to share, answer other questions, offline outside of this webinar and share resources.
And then we do have one more question that came in. Do you cover data mining techniques like classification and optimization techniques like linear programming or simulation in addition to statistical techniques?
So not formally with simulation, but we do examples with it. Like when I introduce regularization and talk about underfit and overfit, we do a simulation. So that's how I bring that in there, but they're not tested on simulation. But all of that is in the book.
Great.
Maybe not linear programming for optimization, but yeah.
Okay. We have one more question, and we also have the poll results up on the screen, so that's great. Now we have a question from Tom. What flavor of R do you use? Do you stick to basics or use tidyverse or other libraries?
Okay, yeah. So we import libraries, but I don't use tidyverse. I don't introduce it right now because my goal is just to get them like in R and working. Like when I clean data, we use GSub. We just use the GSub function. And then they learn how to import packages, but I don't teach that specific package right now.
Great. And then it looks like we do have one more question. Would your book have exercises?
Yes, we've got them in Connect.
Erica. Fantastic.
I'm actually going to post in chat a what we call the digital, what do we call it? A flip book, a digital sampler. So all of you can preview this, and then if you want a desk copy to flip through the book yourself, please send Kristen or I an email, or your sales rep can also get you in touch with that. So here's a little sampler. It's got chapters 1 and 3 in it, as well as a video from Matt Taddy introducing it, and a few other resources for you in the preface, so you can see again what kind of examples are in there. Can
I say one more thing?
Yeah, please do.
So I strongly recommend that you actually read through the chapters and not just flip through the book, because it reads differently than any other textbook out there. So I really am proud of our approach. And I think if you take the time to read through those chapters, you'll see what I'm talking about.
That's great. Yeah, thank you,
We did
Leslie.
get one more question real quick. Why R over Python?
So that was a discussion when we were writing the book, but at the end of the day, we decided on R because it was written by statisticians for statisticians, and we can do any of the methods taught in the book in either R or Python. And R is pretty forgiving for the novice programmer. And we just felt like if you can learn how to code in R, you could transfer that later to coding in Python. But they're both great. They're both in high demand. But that's ultimately why we ended up with R, because it's pretty forgiving for the novice programmer and still very, very powerful.
Just like to have evidence on my side. Great.
Right. Thanks, Fallon. Good to see you.
Do we have any other questions? I know we're over time today, but we are more than happy to stay to answer a couple more questions. Would we consider a Python supplement?
I'm going to let you answer that, Eric.
Eric?
I think there's I would say we're definitely evaluating how we could support Python with this product as well. So I'm not sure what the right resource would be, but Simon, it sounds like maybe you've got some experience with Python as well. I'd like to maybe touch base with you offline and get your input as well.
We're definitely, it's on the radar.
I see statements that R is harder to learn than Python. Do you agree? Why would you think that?
I think it's probably whatever somebody started with, but I do know that R is a little more forgiving with the error messages and stuff. But I think, if you started coding in Python, you'll probably think it's harder to switch to R and vice versa. I think the same thing about RStudio versus base R. Honestly, I think it's probably what you were introduced, to in the first place. That's my perception.
Perfect.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, do we have any other questions today? If you do, Python, I did. Sorry, go ahead, Leslie.
Oh, also Python was, written by computer engineers, like, computer scientists. That's what I was trying to think of. And so if you have a formal background in coding, you might like Python a little bit better. But I find that a lot of business students don't have formal training in any kind of coding, and so R just feels less intimidating. So yeah, that's the last thing I was going to say.
Great. Thank you all for that feedback and all of your very good questions. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and take the lack of questions as a sign that we are good to go today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you, Leslie, for putting on that amazing presentation. I hope everyone got something out of it. I did put my email in the chat one more time. If you have any questions, you would like to receive a desk copy, or you have, and you'd like to connect with either Eric, myself, or Leslie, feel free to reach out anytime. We can go ahead and we'd be happy to work with you. Thank you, Eric. Do you have anything to add before we go?
That's it. Thank you, everybody. Good to see some fun names on there. Look forward to connecting with you in the future. And again, thank you, Leslie. Happy